much like it would hit the moon. But there was probably no oxygen, little or no oxygen. Okay, so now let's talk about the definition of life. How does life start on Earth? Earth contains these chemicals that made longer and longer molecules, and they formed more sophisticated molecules like proteins, amino acids, and eventually DNA. But some of these longer chained molecules had a cell wall. They started forming cell walls. And these walled cells that contained smaller distinct molecules within them, the little molecules within the walled cells, they call organelles. Okay, so what is life then? Excuse me. It's debatable. One thing that life or an organism, think of a single cell, it's got to metabolize. That means it has to take in energy to survive and provide the necessary energy to continue. Okay. It has to be able, when it's metabolized some chemical and it's used that chemical and actually changed that chemical, it has to excrete the chemical that's left over. Those are usually called metabolites, any waste chemicals left over from the process of metabolism. It has to be able to reproduce or duplicate itself so that it stays in existence, right? So if we're going to study some life form, that means it does exist, it's living. Otherwise, it's extinct. So how could you stay in existence if you can't reproduce or replicate? How could a living thing stay in existence if it can't either reproduce or duplicate itself? Again, this is a tricky question, I admit it. Let's see if you can get this one. This was a tough one. Indranil. Menon. Very good. Let's see, can I answer live? Do I type the answer? B, immortal. Absolutely. I know it's a trick question. Yeah, there's one way is you could be immortal. It is interesting. There are some debates whether bacteria some types of bacteria are immortal, but it's more a theoretical debate. I don't think we found anything in existence that can be immortal. But back to life, you have to be able to reproduce or replicate or either be immortal. And life changes to environmental conditions. So that means it has to have a process. Any life form, any organism has to have a process where it can learn in what's in your best metabolic interest. What chemicals do you need? What's in your best reproductive interest? And you have to be able, this organism has to be able to memorize and figure out where those things are. These are some of the qualities of, if we debate the idea of life. Okay, so what ultimately prompted life? Charles Darwin, famous theorist, evolutionary person, said a warm pond of chemicals was the start of life. And some people said, well, maybe lightning struck that warm pond full of chemicals and it started life. But the problem with that idea is actually lightning's relatively infrequent. What's way more common source of energy is solar radiation. So like the process of photosynthesis. So maybe solar radiation warmed up this pond and life spontaneously began. But that's kind of a weak explanation, spontaneous. It's just all of a sudden. Why can't we duplicate that same thing in a laboratory? So one possibility, this is the leading possibility for life on Earth, is that a meteorite or a comet brought in the chemicals, maybe like amino acids, that made up the first living cells. It's possible that meteorites brought them to Earth early. Now, we can ask, would life have developed on Earth without a meteorite? Did a meteorite or a comet bring in life and life develop more quickly on Earth? Was there a cell present in the meteorite? Was life already in the meteorite? Or did the meteorite just bring the chemicals necessary for life to begin on Earth? Now, they have found a meteorite on Earth that actually contains amino acids. So we know it's theoretically possible that these much more sophisticated molecules were created somewhere else in the universe, and a comet brought them to Earth. Now, remember we talked about what's inside a cell? The organelles in cells, like DNA, this twisted molecule codes a single strand of RNA. Then the RNA goes off and codes proteins, and proteins run the activities of the cells. That sequence is not all that important, but the proteins that are created by RNA run the activities of the cell, just like we've talked about. Metabolism, being able to excrete the waste products from metabolism, being able to reproduce or replicate, and being able to learn. And you can think of DNA like a computer code. The DNA contains the memory of the cell. It can store memories and recall them in order to code the RNA that's necessary to code the proteins. So one way of thinking about DNA, and hardly you'll ever get this kind of position, is the DNA is like a genetic memory. It can get passed down across generations, and you'll inherit that DNA from your parents, and they inherit it from their parents. So now every living cell has DNA. And I say most every kind of life has DNA. There are debatable life forms. And one debatable life form, is it really life, is a virus. So, and there's also a interesting molecule form called a prion, P-R-I-O-N. And they think prions do not have DNA. Virus isn't life because it has to live in another cell. It has to hijack a living cell to survive. And that's why they would argue that a virus is not really life. Let's talk about this DNA that has all our genetic memories. The DNA, our DNA, contains the memory to breathe. Lucky it does, because we'd spend a lot of time thinking about breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. No, it's automatic, it's unconscious, because the DNA has a genetic code to breathe. So it's said we share 50% of the same DNA with a banana, 57% with a pumpkin, 66% with a horse, a 97% with rats, and we share 98% plus with a chimpanzee. I use this word, our closest extant relative, and extant means a living. Just to challenge your vocabulary a little bit here, what is the opposite of extant? Mean living. An extant relative. What is the opposite of extant? I'm going to go to the chats here. What's the opposite of extant? Opposite. Yes, bacteria have DNA. Very good. Ryan, Sarang, Prajal, Abba. Extinct is the opposite. Good job. Lots of great thoughts there in those chats. I wish I could answer all the questions. Woo. Okay. So what does it say about DNA if we're so similar? Our DNA is so similar to a chimp. What does that, it says a lot of things about DNA, but what does that say about DNA? Well, here's one thing. Have you ever seen a movie made by chimps? Did you ever read a book written by chimps? I don't think so. So if we're 98+% similar to chimps, then that 1% difference in our DNA must be very important. Indeed, that different DNA, that little bit of difference in DNA codes for brain differences. It codes for neuron differences. And neurons are the cells of the nervous system in the brain. So we talk about scales like it's like a skin cell. We wouldn't call it a neuron, but anything part of the nervous system transmitting information or our brains, then those cells are called neurons. And so that's what our 1% difference. And it makes a huge difference, doesn't it? Because chimps can't make a movie. They do not have the neurons. They don't have the brains that could create a movie. They don't have the brains that could write a book. So that's what it tells me about the DNA. When you hear, oh, we're 98% the same as chimpanzees, that's true. All living things, almost all, have DNA, but it's that 1% difference. What does the 1% difference do? It codes neurologically. It codes for neurons. And that makes the minds of human brains very different from any other animal. Now, let's look at the number of chromosomes. Humans have 23 pairs. Chimps have 24 pairs. And potatoes have 24 pairs. A hermit crab has 117 pairs. And one type of fern has 630 pairs. So this answer, what's the relationship between the number of chromosomes and behavioral complexity? Obviously, there isn't one, because something like a fern is pretty simple and we're pretty sophisticated. So there's no relationship. This is the answer. The relationship, there is no relationship between the number of chromosomes and behavioral complexity. Now we know that genes line these chromosomes, right? So what's the relationship between the number of genes that tell our bodies what to do and behavioral complexity? Well, humans only have 23,000 genes. And this tiny water flea called Daphnia has 31,000 genes. So once again, it's not the number of genes, because if you look at books 50 years old or 70 years old, when I was in school 50 years ago, it would say humans probably have the largest number of genes. And we found out, whoa, it's not true. So again, it's what those genes are doing. It's what those genes are coding for. And I assume you know this guy. I needed an example of a human. And so I looked up who are the hottest Bollywood actors. So I don't know who that is, but I'm sure you do. I'm glad you do, or some of you. Okay, let's talk about this first cell. Now, if you go on Google Images, it'll pull this up for a first cell. And the first cell's life appears about 4 billion years ago. There were increases in oxygen, and we're not certain why, but suddenly there was an increase in oxygen. It looks like it came at the same time that there were increases in oxygen, and they're called prokaryotes. We study modern bacteria to understand what the early prokaryotes looked like, except for one little thing. Prokaryotes, by definition, have no nucleus. They have these organelles inside, they have these organelles these are all these things inside the cytoplasm within this wall and this membrane of the cell. One thing is early prokaryotes probably only had a single strand of DNA. So we actually think, this goes more into biology and chemistry, but we actually think that the first cells only had a single strand of RNA. And RNA, a single strand, is rather unstable compared to a double-stranded DNA. So we think quickly the first prokaryotes started developing double strands of RNA because it's more stable. Look at this already. This is kind of interesting too. This first cell has this flagellum, like this whip-like structure, so that it can move. And already prokaryotes, this life form, already has this cell, has already evolved all of these parts and can move around, and it's detecting chemicals that can help it metabolize in a watery environment. The bacteria flagellum helps it move towards good chemicals and stay away from bad chemicals. It'll actually can, if it bumps into an inanimate object, it can swim away. That's amazingly sophisticated in only 500 million years. Now, remember, these life forms probably didn't live that long, so you could have millions, maybe billions of generations so that they could have the chance to evolve and become more sophisticated. Okay. So the question is, were the prokaryotes thinking? Can we say if this prokaryote 4 billion years ago bumps into something and then it uses flagellum to move away from that object and to move towards things that the prokaryote can sense are in its best metabolic interest? Can we call that thinking? Let's go to our answers here. DDD. It's another trick question. And I thank you for your answers. We could call it thinking. We couldn't call it thinking because they didn't have brains. It depends on your definition of thinking. And again, it's one of those open-ended trick questions that I offer you. And I see, and I like your answer where you said, yes, we can call it thinking because it moves when it needs to in its own interest. You know what? If I had to answer this question myself, I would say yes, prokaryotes were thinking. Now, it's not sophisticated thinking. They're not dreaming, obviously, right? They don't even sleep. But I think we could call it a form of thinking. Whoops. Let's see if I can advance this slide. Okay. And we'll come back to that form of thinking. So, again, in our brief story of life, about 3 billion years, a billion years after prokaryotes, we get a eukaryote. And here's a eukaryote. And what's a eukaryote? It has a nucleus. So what's the difference between prokaryote and eukaryote? Prokaryote comes earlier, doesn't have a nucleus. And now, excuse me, the eukaryote has this nucleus. And I ponder this question. Can we say the nucleus of a cell is analogous to the brain in someone's body? Can we say it's an early form, that the eukaryote is an early or proto form of the brain and the body later? I think so. I think we can say that. Here's a single cell eukaryote, and we're getting to the point where we'll get to the point about single eukaryotes coming together. We're about there right now. But here's a unicellular eukaryote about 1.8 billion years ago called an acritarch. And look at these little things. Already, life is so amazingly sophisticated that it's evolved these little things. And I ask you this question. What do you think in this acritarch? Oh, by the way, these are minuscule. You need to see this fossil, you need a microscope. Okay, so they're very, very small. But what do you think already these things were doing? We'll go to our questions and answers. Yeah, Shakina, that's right. They're probably like flagella or cilia. And Shaurya, you're right. They're probably for sensing or moving. Locomotion, sensing. I like it. I like it. But I haven't seen anybody answer. Whoa, let's see. Maybe I should just wait a little bit. Moving to good places. That's right. Locomotion, maybe intaking food. That's John Javi. That's a possibility. Sensors, probably, Raj. I think so. Finding, that's a possibility too. Finding a prokaryote, and what would they do with it? Maybe metabolize with it. That is a real possibility, that these were for sensing other organisms, other prokaryotes or eukaryotes, to eat them. Now, wouldn't it be interesting if these were, they could be defenses too, right? These all could be poison ends, so it couldn't be eaten. But if it was for sensing to eat prokaryotes, that would be interesting. And that's kind of where we're heading here. One possibility. Okay. Let's start with the animal kingdom instead of the plant kingdom. The plant kingdom probably came earlier, but about 900 million years ago to 600 million years. Oh, by the way, students, you'll see, and they'll say the oldest sponges date back about 600 million years ago. And just 2 days ago, they found fossil sponges that date to 900 million years. So I know you don't consider a sponge an animal, but guess what? Biologists do. And they debate whether these jellyfish called comb jellies, really pretty, and they're not microscopic, whether this was the start of the animal kingdom or sponges were the start of the animal kingdom. And they debate that on what they call paleogenomics. So paleo means old, genomics means dealing with the genes and the evolution of genes. And so when they analyze modern sponges and they analyze modern comb jellies, which are descendants of these original ancestors, it's debatable about who has the oldest genes. And actually now the evidence is pointing towards these comb jellies that are way more sophisticated than sponges came earlier. So very interesting question. Anyway, so they just found out. So that's why you'll see animal kingdom started 600 million years ago. Well, if sponges were around and we consider them animals, then it dates back almost 890 or 900 million years ago. Okay. But really, the animal kingdom, for me, these hardly can be conceived of as animals. The flatworm is clearly an animal. And we have modern flatworms like Amphioxus and Planaria that we study. And they look like this, and they're very small. They're not microscopic. You can see them. And we know in the fossil record, we start seeing flatworms about 545 million years ago. Interestingly, look at this. in the gut of these simple flatworms, in this gut, are bacteria. So remember how we talked about the acritarch was maybe a cell with a nucleus that ate prokaryotes? Well, they eventually evolved in 500 million years to have a very symbiotic relationship. So the bacteria in here are going to help metabolize different kinds of chemicals to give the planaria or the flatworm energy. And that's why we think prokaryotes came before eukaryotes. Okay, so isn't that interesting? The multicellular now eukaryotes, because see, all these are different cells. So this is not a single cell animal. It's bunches of different cells. And they develop a symbiotic relationship. And we do too. Do we have bacteria in our gut? You know, there's more cells, bacterial cells in our body than the body has other kinds of cells. There's more bacteria cells. In fact, if you took all our bacteria, especially in our colon and our guts and our stomach, and you took all that bacteria together, it would weigh and be bigger than your brain if you gathered all the bacteria together. Of course, that would be like 1 trillion cells because they're all very small. So, having these different cells, this movement helps them feeding because they can move around and find the chemicals they need. And it can help them reproduce because they can find other flatworms like it. But it also increases the probability. When you can start moving, it increases the probability that you get eaten. So you can eat other things, but you can also get eaten. They think bilaterality means if you split the animal down the middle, it would be the same on both sides. So that's what bilateral, 2 sides from Latin. And anything that has those 2 sides early, we call bilaterians. Okay, so now we already see that the cells are being selected for cells that can sense good foods, bad foods, find mates, avoid predators. And these cells are called sensory cells that sense the environment, movement cells, and then there's a cell that communicates between these two. So the cells that coordinate sensory and motor neurons, we will call brain neurons or the original nervous system neurons. Okay, so sensory neurons, I spelled perceive wrong, bad me. It's I before E, except after C. Anyway, sensory neurons get naturally selected for to perceive their environment. And the sensory neurons, there's different ones, of course. So there's smell, I put is smell number 1, the number 1 sensory neuron in these early animals. Vision, taste, touch. You can touch physically, you can be aware of things electrically is a form of touch, hearing, and the placement in the environment. So the motor neurons get selected for to find all these good things in the interest of the life of the organism. The brains develop to guide the movements that enhance feeding and replication and to avoid bad foods and predators. And brains usually develop on the leading end of an animal so you can better guide these movements. That would be so that, let's say, your brain's not in your feet. It would be really tough. Your brain's up on the top of your head, guiding where to go, which is a much more efficient, of course, design. Okay, so if we ask the question, what are brains for in the first place? It looks like brains are for moving to the right place. And the brain's neurons interpret the sensory information and then direct the motor neurons to go to the right place. Same with the human body. We have all these senses that get interpreted by the brain, and the brain's going to tell the motor neurons where to go. So already by a 500 million years ago, we already had cells, eukaryotes, differentiating themselves into sensory neurons, motor neurons, or brain neurons. So now let's talk about consciousness. So thinking was using your brain to make decisions, being aware of being alive, aware of your feelings, contemplating, wondering, dreaming. So the initial decisions that flatworms make, just like I asked you, do prokaryotes think? Can flatworms think? Yeah, it is a form of thinking. But they obviously weren't aware of being alive, but they obviously made decisions. They probably didn't wonder, they probably didn't daydream, they didn't dream, but they were making decisions, which is an early form of thinking. So I'm going to make the argument that this first form of thinking was a first form of consciousness, a first form of awareness. And I have a new word for you. It looks like inchoate, doesn't it? Inchoate, but pronounce it inchoate. So let's call this inchoate consciousness, these flatworms, because they were making decisions. So the word inchoate means rudimentary or beginning form or not fully developed. So we have inchoate consciousness in flatworms. And students, when you go back to your parents and family, you can tell them today what you learned about. You learned about inchoate forms of consciousness, and flatworms had it because they could make decisions. Now, when animals could move, these flatworms, as I said, they're inchoate brains. They're more elaborate nervous systems than sponges or comb jellies. They had an enhanced adaptability. Flatworms were amazing. But their success in reproducing probably created new kinds of predators and prey. So now there was this explosion of life, and this period is called the Cambrian, because we know 545 million years ago, there was an explosion of fossils all over the world. And actually in India, you have really good examples in the Vindhyan Basin in central India. All kinds of amazing fossils. And they had, look at these, spines that are obviously for protection, hard scales for protection, hard parts like this clam or mussel for protection. So now life forms start to differentiate from simple bacteria and those simple acritarchs into all kinds of spines, toxins, scales, teeth, horns, spikes. And they also not only use body, morphological means body, they not only use all of those body parts, but also they can camouflage themselves to avoid being preyed upon. They can fly. They might dig into the ground. They might live only during the day, diurnal, or they might adopt nocturnal living. Or they might just live in trees to avoid predators, or only live in water or hot water vents, or only live in deserts. So this explosion of life 500 million years ago, 500 million years ago, is called the Cambrian period. And we're getting life getting more sophisticated. So beyond the flatworms, there was probably some transitions, but we probably went from a fish with a backbone, vertebral fish, but they had very small brains. And this is about 400 million years ago. They actually caught one of these in the 1950s, a coelacanth, and it looked exactly like the fossils that were 400 million years old. And they thought it had gone extinct. It looked so exact, they decided that that fish managed to reproduce and survive all that period. Okay, let's look at a fish brain. Since I didn't buy this slide from Shutterstock, they put Shutterstock on it, but I liked it. Okay, so let's look at a brain in a fish. By the way, they're very, very small. Compared the fish's brain compared to the size of the fish. I don't know if you've ever looked and cut open a fish or a fish head, but boy, it's hard to find the brain. Anyway, we can see what's going on with the fish's brain here. An olfactory bulb, which we have, and of course, olfactory bulbs are sense of smell. They have optic nerve, which is for vision. The cerebrum is called the brain. And what's wrong about this slide is that this optic lobe, this is part of the brain that interprets vision, is really part of the brain. So when it says cerebrum, it should point here, here, and here, and here, down here in this inferior lobe. The olfactory bulb should be considered part of the cerebrum. So a cerebrum means the whole brain. Now, in Latin, this word means cerebellum. It means little brain or smaller brain, and in Latin. And the first anatomists from the Roman times or the Greek times recognized that even humans and animals, most all of them had a cerebellum, a little brain below the big brain. And we'll come back to that too. Down here, the pituitary, of course, is involved in hormones and communication between cells and what they do with hormones. Here's the medulla, and this is part of the spinal cord. So the brain's on top of the spinal cord runs along the vertebrae of the fish all the way to the tail. Okay. So we get the fish that managed to stay and now evolve, and they find their niche by living on land. But they can also go in the water, and we call them amphibians. And amphibians appear about 365 million years ago. So remember, on Earth, we only have plant life on Earth. There are no animals 300 million years ago on dry Earth, I should say. So what happens is these first reptiles, and they're going to be the dry Earth. They're going to manage the first animal forms being able to live outside the water. They need water, but they don't live in it. And these reptiles now dominate from 300 million years ago until a big extinction. By the way, there's been 5 or 6 really big extinctions on Earth. There was one that occurred 65 million years ago, and it wiped out half of all animals and half of all plants. Here's based on fossils, a 300 million year old fossil called Hylonomus, and it looks exactly like a lizard. And in fact, we think all lizards are descended from Hylonomus. So when you see a lizard, next time you see a lizard, you're looking at a life form, a living fossil, probably 300 million years old, and hadn't changed much, as you can kind of see. Okay, I'm going to pause here for a second and see what we've got in terms of your wonderful, wonderful questions. Sharia, you say, why did life originate on water rather than land? Probably because, remember, humans are, 90% water. So we developed in a watery environment because that was beneficial for the chemicals that we needed to evolve. It would have been tougher to do it on land. We might have been able to do it, but not without a water supply because we're so watery. Is COVID-19 kind of like an extinction? Absolutely, except the big extinctions were always probably due to volcanoes or meteorites. No, the medulla is part of the spinal cord. Very good question. The hypothalamus in a fish brain. Some of these, like the hypothalamus in humans, are very difficult to find in these early animals and fish. But yeah, COVID-19 might be like the modern meteorite that wipes us out again. Rashtra, how do we convert into human beings? I'm getting there. Be patient. What is this 65 million years ago trying to state? Okay, let's get there. Whoops. Okay, so reptiles get bigger and bigger until this extinction. So from 300 million years ago, we go from lizards and we go up to T-Rex. But when that meteorite hit, what it did was darken the earth, and it really changed how many plants could live. And remember, certain animals are dependent on certain plants. So 50% of all kinds of plants went extinct. 50% of all animals went extinct. And guess what? On land, no animal survived after that meteorite explosion that weighed more than 25 kilograms. Were there any animals alive that were bigger than 50 pounds or 55 pounds or 25 kilograms that survived? Yes, but only in water. So we do know that there were turtles more recent than 65 million years ago that survived who are way bigger than 50 pounds, but not on land. Okay, so let's do a summary, kind of what's going to inform. I like this word, informed. We say that a lot in biology and the cognitive sciences. And that means another word for informed would be influence. Modern human brains have been influenced. They were influenced by the first cells, the prokaryotes, bacteria, because we still carry them. They were influenced by having moving cells, by groups of cells that all do the same thing. Our modern human life was informed by the first flatworms, by fishes, by amphibians, by reptiles. So you can say our brains have been informed by all the first invertebrates, no backbone, like a prokaryote or a eukaryote or bacteria, and then by the vertebrates. So all of these things helped influence, I like the word informed, helped influence modern brains. So you can say there were additions made to our brains rather than subtractions from earlier brains. Okay, something exciting happens about 200 million years ago. From the animal line, from the reptile line, we get mammals. And mammals were really different than reptiles because mammals usually have hair. They usually have 4 legs. They nurse their young. Mammal brains become way bigger than reptiles' brains, especially the people use the word forebrain, which really means the frontal part of the brain, but the word's misused. I almost wish I hadn't put forebrain. But anyway, mammals have bigger brains, and the top of the brain is called the cortex. And that's what really expanded in mammals. What does that mean? It means that these mammals are way more flexible to environmental changes. So reptiles have like these rules or algorithms built into their DNA. If it gets hot, we do this. If it gets cold, we do this. It doesn't think, it's automatically driven by the DNA. Mammals were way more flexible to environmental changes, and that's what a bigger brain did. It made them behaviorally more flexible. And remember, mammals that survived this extinction better than the bigger reptiles. Number one, because they were smaller. But number two, because their brains were bigger, they could survive the extinction at 65 million years ago. And smaller reptiles did survive. This guy is the platypus. And I just love, I remember when I was like 10 years old, I was just fascinated by the platypus. And it's a very unusual mammal because mammals usually give birth to live organisms, to live babies. And the platypus lays eggs. So it's one of the most unusual mammals, an egg-laying mammal, unusual. Okay. In mammalian brains, the surface of the brain is so expanded compared to reptiles that some people call it the neocortex. So the word cortex and neocortex are synonymous. Biologically, it means the same thing. But the neocortex becomes the largest part of the brain in mammals, the surface, and in humans. So already by 200 million years ago, we get changes in thinking. Way different than the reptiles or any other mammal or animal per date. Okay, so here's that fish brain that we talked about. Forebrain and midbrain really should be combined, and we should call this whole name the cerebrum. Now, the cerebrum actually officially includes the cerebellum. Okay, so you can see in amphibians, what's getting bigger is this front part of the brain. And you can see reptiles also have a larger forebrain or cortex. Pigeons, it's getting larger. And look in mammals. This is why they call it the neocortex. Look how expanded it is across fish, amphibians, reptiles, and it's developing these twists that give it a bigger surface area, okay? We call these a gyrus, so they're gyrations because they're twisted. And what that provides, a twisting provides a greater surface area. Class, can you see me? Does this picture appear on your screen? Yes? I guess I can't hear any sounds. I just wanted to show you how that works, okay? With a very simple demonstration. I hope you can see this. Here's my sheet of paper. Let's say this is the surface, right? And it's going to take up this amount of area, right? This piece of paper is going to take up this amount of area. But look at this. And this is 8 inches by 11 inches. Look at this. Now I'm taking up less surface area. See that? Now the surface area is less, but the overall area is the same. And so those gyrations in the brain, what are those gyrations doing? These are called a sulcus. And these sulci, the plural of sulcus, they're just like the surface of the brain. It's just that it exists down within the gyrations. Okay, let's move on. So here's the relative size of the human brain. You can see it is huge here. You do see a lot of convolutions and gyrations and gyruses, and you can see that in the chimpanzee, but you can see we have way more surface area contained within these sulcuses than in the chimpanzee. Let's look at our brain versus a dolphin brain. Here's the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. Dolphin also has the gyrations and the sulci and a huge cerebellum. Here's our cerebellum. So because the dolphin, dolphins always keep moving. And very interestingly, to keep moving and to keep breathing, because they have to come up and get oxygen, that's why they have bigger cerebellums, because their lives are so devoted to moving. We don't have to move all the time. So we don't need as big a cerebellum, but that's interesting and debatable. But anyway, that's why they have it. And guess what? Since they have to keep moving, when do dolphins sleep? Well, guess what? A dolphin is always sleeping. Half of its hemisphere, half of the cerebral hemisphere goes to sleep and becomes inactive, and this half stays active. And about every 15 minutes, then this side goes to sleep and this side stays active and runs the cerebellum that keeps it moving and breathing. So dolphins do dream. They do have dream sleep. They have regular sleep, but they alternate hemisphere sleep. Okay, here's an elephant brain. Look at its cerebellum, huge. Now the cerebellum, the purpose is for movement, and it moves the limbs. So why do elephants have such a big cerebellum? In fact, if you count the cells in the brain here and count the cells here, 98% of the neurons of an elephant are contained within the cerebellum. It's just that these cells are bigger and these cells are smaller, but there's 98% of all the elephant's neurons. How many neurons is that? About 250 billion brain cells or brain neurons in an elephant, 98% in the cerebellum. Now, another question, class. Why does an elephant have such a big cerebellum? I'm going to return to my questions and answers that have been so wonderful. If an elephant brain is bigger than a human, why are we smarter than them? We're getting there. We only have 80 billion neurons. They have 250. To balance its heavy body, that's part of it. But what is it? Okay, a big body to control its movements. That's true. They always have to keep standing. To help move its body. More cells to control. Okay, so far nobody's getting the right answer. These are good answers, but not the correct answer. Why does an elephant? Okay, you need to get a hint. It needs to keep traveling. It doesn't travel all the time. To control locomotion, to balance. Okay, so they can remember water holes because of their weight. Good answers, but not the right answer. But you'll get it right away if I give you a hint. Does an elephant have hands? It's got 4 legs. Can it use its front legs to eat? What does it use to eat? What does it use to throw water on itself? What does it use to dust itself? What does it use to touch other elephants? Its trunk. So its trunk is like one giant hand. So why do elephants have a big cerebellum? For all the reasons you said, but primarily to run its trunk. I just like elephants. I imagine you do too. Okay. So here's the human brain. And they will say forebrain. So if they say forebrain, it usually means frontal lobe, parietal lobe here. Frontal lobe is where we kind of make decisions. We'll get there. Parietal lobe is where we imagine things. This is where we interpret all of our senses. All the information that comes from our senses are interpreted by the parietal lobe. Occipital lobe back here does vision. It sees color. It sees shape. It doesn't know, the occipital lobe, when it gets the information from the eyes, it doesn't know anything different than color and shapes. And it doesn't know what the shape is. But this is called primary visual cortex. And this is the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe is where we're going to have language and a lot of internal thinking. The pons in Latin means bridge. So when the first anatomists, including the Greeks and the Romans, were looking at animals and they saw the pons, why would they call it a bridge? This is really a tough question, even for biologists, because the cerebellum connects to the whole brain through the pons. It's not connected up this way, it's connected this way, and it connects right to the area called the pons. So the Latin anatomists 2,000 years ago called it a bridge because it's bridging the information from the cerebellum into the pons, and then it goes up into the rest of the brain and here down in the spinal cord. Okay, so more brain, thinking parts of the brain. So this frontal lobes, there's in cognitive sciences, they call it the central executive. because this is where the front part of the brain makes decisions. This part, this is the anterior, means front part, cingulate cortex, and that's part of the frontal lobes, and it pays attention. It tells your brain, hey, pay attention to this. Hey, pay attention to that. Back here, remember parietal lobes? I said it does perceptual processing too. So it takes all the senses, integrates them, and sends that information to the central executive to make a decision. Down here, remember I said temporal lobes is language. So we have two important areas. Wernicke's area is where you hear me and you hear what I'm saying. Broca's area over here is where you actually speak what you're thinking. So when you're thinking internally, it's going right here in Wernicke's area. These neurons of the brain are designed for inner speech. They're designed for all those things you think about. And if you want to say, oh, I want to say yes to that, you think of that here, and the information, this arrow is going the wrong way, that information goes over here to Broca's area, and that's where you'll tell the tongue to speak the words that you are thinking right here. Yes. Acha. Okay, back here, remember we talked about the occipital lobes is vision and spatial recognition. But that information actually goes up here to the parietal lobes and down here into the temporal lobes to be processed more sophisticatedly. Okay. We talked about the hippocampus a little bit earlier. Bilateral means it's both sides of the brain, and it's a structure, and the amygdala sits right on top or in the front anterior part. And they called it, the hippocampus, they called it a seahorse because this is a human hippocampus. Here's the amygdala, and this is the back end. And because it looked like a seahorse, that's why they called it the hippocampus. Okay, so the hippocampus becomes larger in mammals. And the hippocampus is in charge of interpreting odors and remembering whether an odor is good or bad. The amygdala does one thing, and that is to detect fear. So we have cells in our brain that without the cortex, without thinking, they automatically make us fearful. And they detect, these cells in the amygdala detect when something is fearful. And that happens really unconsciously. I don't know if you've ever walked sometime and you've seen a root that looks like a snake and you jump. And that's because your amygdala detected a shape that looks like a snake, and it didn't need your cortex to do it. It didn't wait for your cortex to go, is that a snake or is that a root? It would be really important for early life forms, especially on land, when there were these predators and dangerous things like snakes that could kill us, for you to have cells that didn't take their time. They had to be immediate decision-making, and that's the amygdala. Okay, and so the modern hippocampus retains its memory for odors and the location of the odors. But here's what a human hippocampus does. It can memorize words. So what part of your brain just memorized inchoate? What part of your brain just memorized extant? The opposite of extinct. Extant means living. Your hippocampus did it. And interestingly, it's going to memorize those words. And in about 2 years, the word will leave your hippocampus and it'll be retrieved by other areas of your brain. So the words don't stay in the hippocampus, but they get converted into memories by the hippocampus. Okay, it's getting exciting. These primate brains, now primates diverge from mammals. These first primates, and we're a primate. Okay, so this is our lineage. We're not in the